HUD has released new guidance on how housing providers can deal with tenants requesting reasonable accommodations for service animals and emotional support animals. This guidance is going to be extremely valuable in how you assess those requests and accept documentation. This week, we've brought in special guest Jennifer Hicks to go through all these new regulations. So stay tuned to get up to speed on this new guidance from HUD. Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. You're tuned into episode 106 in the Talking Real studio. And Nabil, how's your day? Do you hear those crickets? Nabil's not here with me today. It's so sad. I'm all alone in the Talking Real studio to get this thing kicked off. Unfortunately, Nabil is sick and at home, so send some thoughts to him and hope he gets better really quickly because we can't wait to have him back here in the office. And make sure that you guys are out there being safe because the bugs are going around, the flu and all that. So stay healthy out there. Take your vitamin C or whatever it is and wash your hands. So anyway, this week we are talking about some new guidance that is released out of the Department of the Housing and Urban Development. And so Ben Carson, the Secretary of HUD, back in 2016, promised that new guidance would be coming on dealing with emotional support animals and service animals for housing providers. And now, 4 years later, we finally have it. And this is going to be fantastic. This guidance provides practically a script for you to use and gives you everything that you need as a housing provider dealing with these issues. So we've brought in special guest Jennifer Hicks, who has a lot of experience in property management, and we're excited to bring this updated HUD guidance on it. So stay tuned because we've got all the information to keep you up to speed and in compliance with the Fair Housing Act right now. I'd like to welcome a special guest on Talking Real. We're joined here today by Jennifer Hicks. Jennifer, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. We're excited that you joined us today to talk about fair housing and some of the new guidance we received from HUD. But first, I want our listeners to know a little bit about you. So you're from the Tulsa area.
Yes.
And you're a realtor, of course.
Absolutely.
And so you do a lot of property management. So tell us a little bit about kind of your property management background and what you do there.
Sure. I started my property management firm about 3.5 years ago now. So I've been doing that for about 4 years with all my clients that I started off my first year. And right now, I currently have about 120 properties that I manage myself, and I only have one little assistant. So it's a big undertaking, but it's rewarding for sure to be a property manager, and that's majority of my business now.
Okay, so you're pretty hands-on then on you do everything. I mean, you're there cleaning up the properties when somebody moves out and getting them ready.
No.
Not
That definitely gets delegated.
Yeah. But doing all the showings and getting the leasing done and all that.
Yeah.
So you've probably dealt with some reasonable accommodation requests under fair housing laws too, I assume.
Yes, reasonable accommodations have definitely come up in the past, and some not so reasonable. But you do try to accommodate regardless of what it is. For sure. Because ultimately, it's a family, it's a person that lives in the home that you are managing, and that should come first, honestly, because we're all humans. We all need a place to live, and when someone says, hey, I need, shorter transfers between the carpet and the hardwood, you do what you can, right? Because it's really not that big of a deal.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, it's good that we have these. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of people who have disabilities of varying degrees, and being able to make sure that they have equal access to housing and have the ability to live in a house, and if that requires some small modifications, like you just mentioned there, that somebody who may have some mobility issues, and being able to make sure the thresholds between rooms and doors and things like that is going to keep them from tripping and falling. That's an easy thing.
Yes.
You had mentioned to me earlier too about light switches, for example, that somebody you had dealt with that asked if you could change out the light switches because whatever was in there was not good for their, lack of mobility in their hands, and switched out to like push button switches instead.
Either push button or even motion.
Yeah.
So that whenever they just walk into the room, they don't have to reach.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. Yeah.
And those are easy modifications to make to a property and very reasonable in most cases.
Absolutely.
We've seen, though, and we've talked about on the podcast before about dealing with animals. And this is a touchy one that has come up a lot recently. And we've seen some varying complicated scenarios for people. And one, just kind of understanding the regulation of what is required if somebody's asking for a reasonable accommodation to the pet policy, which would be, can we have an animal that's not a pet, but instead is a service animal or some other type of assistance animal, kind of understanding what those terms mean, and then what you can ask for. And people, in my experience, have been very concerned about even asking for information or what the boundaries are.
Yes, I've definitely run across that personally. Whenever I've been interviewing clients, or interviewing potential tenants to go into a house, I say, do you have any pets? And I'm very specific on the word pet. And then if they actually go into the conversation of, well, I have a service animal or that sort of thing, before I was always just saying, okay, that's fine. I just need documentation to have on file so that I know, and that sort of thing. And I just knew from conversations and passing and having a brief understanding of the law as far as being able to charge pet fees and that sort of thing. And it was very easy to say, it's not a pet, so you don't get to charge a pet fee.
Right.
It was a very simple, black and white, just in that line.
For sure.
But now I think we can get into it a little bit more as far as it's a lot easier to dictate and have that conversation.
Absolutely.
Because it can get very touchy.
Yeah. So what we're talking about here is the Housing and Urban Development HUD that we're all familiar with has released some new guidance. And this was something that the Secretary of HUD, Ben Carson, he's been talking about for years, quite literally years, that back in 2016 even said this is something we're going to tackle. HUD's going to issue some new guidance on how to deal with service animals, emotional support animals, that kind of thing, to help housing providers comply with the law. 'Cause that's what we want. We want everybody to comply with the law, but I think there was this lack of understanding of what the law is, and from both the perspective of the requester who wants to have the animal and the housing provider who just wants to follow the law. And so finally we have that guidance, and this is great. We'll make sure we link to this in our show notes so you can get a copy of it. It's a 19-page memo is really what it is. It's guidance offered by HUD. This isn't a change in the law, so nothing in here actually changes what the law is. This is just HUD's guidance on how, if you're a housing provider, how you can comply with the law. And it has two parts to it. The first part is going to talk about basically the best practices for assessing a person's request to have an animal as a reasonable accommodation. So how do you deal with that? And how do you assess that? What kind of questions you can ask them, those kinds of things. And then there's a part at the end that has a few pages of guidance on documenting an individual's need for assistance animals in housing. And this is really helpful too, because this tells you when you say, like you mentioned, ask, well, I need documentation. Before you were like, I don't even know what that means, right? Like, okay, a letter from a doctor, sure. Like, what else is that? And they've really designed this in a way where you as a landlord can give this to a person. If you say, well, I need documentation, and they say, well, what does that mean? You give this to them and say, this is what HUD says is, documentation for, that you can go to a doctor or some of the other examples, and what can be included as good documentation for this. So I think this would be really helpful to all the people out there. And again, they give you in this, which I thought was great, basically a script. I mean, this is almost a script of the conversation that you may have with somebody. And I do want to start out and just kind of remind people that we're talking about two different things here. You have service animals, and then you have other, what are broadly called a support animal or an assistance animal of some kind. And this is, a service animal is defined by ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Fair Housing Act has basically incorporated that. But then you also have these other things that are trained or untrained animals that do work, perform a task, provide assistance, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for an individual with disability.
Right.
That's the second category, and you kind of have to address them a little bit differently. And we're going to tell you how to do that and then give you this script, or at least we're going to go through at least parts of the script to make sure that everybody kind of understands what that is. And again, the best thing is if you do property management, like you have to go get this document and take a look at it. You can get on HUD's website. We're going to link to it. So we're going to go through bits and pieces of it. We can't go through everything. So make sure you go check this out because it's very, very helpful and very clear and easy to understand, I think.
Yes, it definitely was an eye-opener for me as a property manager daily.
Yeah.
For having this, and will be referring to it.
Yeah. And this is important because they've said that FHA complaints concerning a denial of a reasonable accommodation is like 60% of the complaints that they receive. And a huge portion of those are specific to assistance animals.
Right.
So,
I saw that.
Yeah. So it's a big deal that everybody needs to make sure they kind of understand. And one thing we also want to bring up too that they mentioned in this memo that's important is that they're saying here that if you have already made an assessment and told somebody they can have an emotional support animal or whatever it is, this is not an opportunity to go back and redo it. That they specifically had said that providers should not reassess requests for reasonable accommodations that have already been granted. So if we're going through this and you look at it and you're like, oh, I did that one wrong, I'm going to urge you caution to go back and just be careful about how you address that. This doesn't mean go back and tell people, and I'm going to kick you out.
Right, exactly. And, that's going through that as well, of having to reassess, saying like, oh, I got the wrong documentation, or I got something totally fraudulent. Well, you already said that you would let them in.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, this is an area that what you say matters, how you say it, and all that. So, let's go through some of that. So, the first thing, like we just said, you've got to treat. You sort of have two different analyses here. One is the ADA analysis. Is it a service animal? Mm-hmm. And then after that, we'll get if it's not a service animal. Then you go under the Fair Housing Act assessment to say, well, is it a support animal there?
Is it is it a support animal?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is interesting. We start out and they say, what is a service animal? And again, this is defined by the ADA. And the ADA says a service animal means any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. That includes physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disability. And so other species of animals, whether wild or domestic, trained or untrained, are not service animals for the purposes of this definition. And the work or tasks performed by a service animal must be directly related to the individual's disability. So this is one that tends to be a little more obvious, right? Mm-hmm. If they're a service animal.
I agree. I think I think this also sort of suggests that if you're training a service animal and you are a trainer and taking the dog home, under this, I would assume that doesn't count because you're not the one with the disability. You're training one.
That I think that is correct. That's a great point. So to get into that, let's go through these questions. Mm-hmm. So we start out with service animal analysis. So somebody says, I've got this animal. Okay. First of all, is it an ADA animal? Is it a service animal? The first question is the animal a dog? If it's yes, okay, well, that's our first step because under the ADA, it can only be a dog. If the answer is no, that doesn't mean that they may not still be able to have it under the FHA. It's just we go to the second analysis. We start, is it a dog? Yes. Is it readily apparent that the dog is trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability? Okay, if the answer is yes, then you're good to go. If the answer is no, then we're going to go on to the next question. And when we talk about this is one of those, is it trained to perform a service
specific
or
task.
something specific task? We're talking about, a guide dog, right? This is obvious, right? You can tell if a person's blind and has a dog that is their seeing eye dog, right? That's sort of the characteristic quintessential service animal,
right?
In my opinion. So, and so if they say no to that one, that it's not readily apparent what they're there to do, then it is advisable for the housing provider to limit the inquiries to the following 2 questions. So this is only if it's obvious that this animal is performing a task, you don't ask any more questions. Yes, they get that animal reasonable accommodation. If it's not so obvious, then you can only ask this, quote, thank you, HUD, for the quote. Is the animal required because of a disability? And 2, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? That's it. That's all you got to ask.
Easy peasy.
Easy. So, I think this is really helpful, again, because it gives you that script. I mean, you could take this back and create an office policy. And
absolutely. You can take this if you work for a company or if you own a company for property management, then you can take this and reference it in your policy.
Yeah. Saying
based on the FDA, then you get to ask these questions.
Yeah.
And if the outcome of those questions is this, then it's a service animal.
Yeah, real easy. Mm-hmm. And I mean, again, I love the way they did this.
I think it's well written. It's very simple to read it quickly.
Yeah.
And then get an understanding of what you need to be doing if someone says that they have a service animal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So service animals, I think, are pretty easy.
Mm-hmm. That one's the easier one.
Let's move on to the next one. So again, if we've gotten out of this where, okay, it's not a dog or it's not,
it hasn't been trained for a specific task.
Exactly. So now we're in this, okay, just because the answer to that is no, it's not a service animal, you still have to go under this now, FHA, housing specific analysis, to ask, is this an animal that I have to give a reasonable accommodation to? So it's going to be real similar, but it's definitely a little bit more involved and you may have to ask some more questions. But this is where I think that everyone's going to feel a lot better about what you can and can't do.
Right, because these questions keep you out of the gray area of asking questions that would be against fair housing.
Exactly. Because the bottom line here is you're never going to want to ask about the nature. Yes, exactly. Don't ask them the why. Why do you need it?
Just keep why out.
Yeah. Why, what is your disability? You don't want to talk about that. But again, we're going to go through what you can ask, which is great. So we're going to start out by has the individual requested a reasonable accommodation? So in some way, shape, or form, they have to say, this is a support animal.
That is what that's what I have always understood, that as a landlord, you're not really supposed to offer an accommodation because then that's assuming a disability,
right?
With the fair housing and all that.
Yeah.
But if they ask, then you determine if it's reasonable.
Exactly, and use a little intuition here because the way they ask it's not necessarily a specific. I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation because this animal is an emotional support animal. It's not always going to be that way, but they may say something that makes you realize, okay, they're telling me.
Right. We're talking about the general public.
Exactly.
No one's going to be breaking out this FDA guidance as a tenant trying to get into a property unless they've done their homework. And there aren't that many.
Right. Exactly. So, but they've said something that makes you realize, okay, this person has a disability and they're saying something that is now making me think that they want to have this animal because of that. That's sort of like step one, pretty general. So now we get into how do you actually assess that once that's happened? And the first part is, does the person have an observable disability, or does the housing provider already have information giving them reason to believe that the person has a disability? So there's a distinction between observable and non-observable,
right?
Which is, I think, kind of tough.
Yeah. I mean, but you can also have caseworkers calling for their patient or for their, for the person that is applying for the housing.
Oh, that's great.
And, they'll say, hey, I have someone that's going to be reaching out to you to look at this house. They have such and such. And that's enough documentation to understand that they're working with a caseworker so that that there is a disability that you need to have reasonable accommodations for. So,
that's a really good point. I mean, this could be something like, they ended up, maybe they didn't have a disability, but they ended up in the hospital, and now their hospital caseworkers calling you to say, hey, this person's going to have some disability related needs when they come back in the house.
Right.
That's a great point that we've never really talked about before.
And that can be a benefit as a landlord if you become that type of person that when those caseworkers call you and you say, absolutely, I'd be happy to accommodate whatever your patient needs. you seem like the good guy and you're going to be called more often.
Absolutely.
Because you have those houses and you have the ability to accommodate.
That's a great point.
As much as you can.
For sure. Some other examples of observable impairments include blindness or low vision, deafness or being hard of hearing, mobility limitations, other types of impairments with, certain types of obvious symptoms. They may be intellectual impairments. They may be something like you could tell that maybe they've had a stroke or Parkinson's disease, something along those lines that has created a physical disability. These are the things that HUD is talking about when you see observable. And they're saying you're not entitled to know what their diagnosis is, and you should never ask that.
Right.
But you can visibly see if you've met with a person or even sometimes talking on a phone, you may be able to be readily apparent that this person has a disability.
I have a disability, and not everyone can see that it's apparent.
There you go. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect example.
So
if the question is yes, that they do have something readily observable, then you kind of skip to the next part after this next question. If it's no, that it's not readily apparent, then you get to ask for information that reasonably supports that this person has a disability. Okay. And so this is where you have to be real careful about what you can ask and what you can't ask, because you don't want to say, well, I want to see your medical records to tell me why you've got a disability. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. But they've told you exactly what you can say here. So if they haven't, you don't necessarily, it's not obvious, then you can ask for certain information that may be helpful. And to help you with that,
what page is it?
Let's look at page 10 here.
10?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm too far behind.
Yeah. So basically what they say here is that what you're first of all encouraged to do is direct them to the guidance on documenting an individual's need for assistance, animals, and housing. We have that in this packet. That's what they're talking about. But basically what you're saying is, I would like to see information that shows that you have a disability. Okay. And that may include determination of disability from a federal, state, or local government agency, the fact that they receive Social Security disability income, that they maybe get veterans disability benefits, maybe they're receiving services from vocational rehab agency, some other kind of disability benefits. Those are all examples that would prove that they have a disability.
Right.
Eligibility for housing assistance or housing voucher that's due to a disability, that's an example. And then also, obviously, something from a healthcare professional like a physician, optometrist, psychiatrist, those kinds of things.
So you can come to your landlord with a doctor's note.
Absolutely. A doctor's note counts. But it's all these other things, too, that they may have something else that shows, well, look, I'm on Social Security disability, and here's proof of that. Well, that's going to prove that they have a disability.
Right.
So, again, you're not asking.
That's a lot of documentation.
It is. So you're not asking what kind of disability do you have, but,
right.
show me that you have a disability
right.
if it's not readily apparent.
Exactly. And you can't call the doctor and say, what's their diagnosis?
Exactly.
That's just rude.
Exactly. That is rude. Something that doesn't count, and this is, I think, the biggest piece that people have concern with, is this documentation from the internet. And what they're saying here is that some of these websites that sell the certificates, registrations, or licensing documents for assistance animals, that you can basically disregard those. That's what they're saying here. It says in HUD's experience that documentation by itself is not sufficient to establish that a person has a disability. It's got to be something else from, again, a licensed healthcare professional, something along those lines that says, yes, Steve Smith has a disability. That's what you got to have.
Right. So. Exactly. And I think the documentation from the internet, the fact that they put this in there, is going to make this so much easier. There are going to be a lot fewer calls, or I'm sure attorneys don't like it. Like, oh darn it, I'm not going to be able to charge $50 for them to ask me this question.
Right, exactly.
But I think because this is federal as well, there are other states that have had these issues with the emotional support animals and that sort of thing. Right. But the fact that it's here on this documentation is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because then, in my opinion, if you're going on the internet and paying $200, $300 for, the certification to not have to pay a pet fee, you might as well have paid the pet fee.
Yeah.
Unless, I mean, of course, there are, apartment complexes, there are landlords that charge an immense amount of money.
Or just flat out prohibit it.
Or flat out prohibit it,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So I get it, that, why people originally started using that.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that it's there so that, there is documentation here, or this is at least helping the landlords a little bit.
Exactly. And it's helping the people that have legitimate disabilities.
Exactly.
Because it's giving that guidance that, like, I know that the person that's coming, I can ask for documentation that says, yes, this person has a disability. One thing to be cautious about with the internet is that telemedicine is a thing. So you can have a doctor visit over the internet. And if that doctor prescribes, or recommends an emotional support animal, something along those lines, that is going to count. So not all information from the internet's bad, but just those ones that just say, oh, here's a certificate.
Oh, here's a certificate or a license or whatever, or buy a dog tag that says that it's a service animal or something like that. That's exactly.
Exactly. So the next step, once they've established that they do have a disability, then the next part is that does that documentation they've provided also show that that animal is needed to assist with that disability or alleviate the symptoms of that disability.
Okay.
This is where it gets to where they've got to make that connection. And this is, again, why giving this guidance packet to a tenant, if they're like, well, what does the letter from my doctor need to say, is going to be real helpful. Because what this does is not only do they have to have a disability, but they have to have a disability related need for that animal. So that letter you get should say, Steve Smith is under my care. Steve has a disability, and Steve has a disability related need for this dog to support, to alleviate the symptoms or whatever. That is what we'd be looking for. Or a cat.
Or a hamster.
Exactly.
Because we'll get into that in a second as well, as far as what animals that aren't service animals but are support animals.
Yes.
We'll go over that in a second.
So that's all you're asking for. Again, you're saying, do they have a disability? And you've got a doctor, you've got a psychiatrist, you've got some other documentation. Maybe it is from a government entity or something related to that, that shows they have a disability, and that they've also proven that this animal is related to that disability. Beyond that, can't really ask for anything, but this also clears up the internet-related issue, and it tells you exactly what you can ask for.
Right.
So, types of animals. Like you said, a service animal is a dog, but the Fair Housing Act doesn't keep that quite so close. There's a few more options. We've heard of the peacock, right? The emotional support peacock.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard of that one.
I'm glad this is cleared up too.
I do too. I think as it states on here, dog, cat, small bird, rabbit, hamster, gerbil, other rodents, fish, turtles, or other small domesticated animals. So that doesn't include. You said it doesn't include snakes, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't, because
which is weird.
They've specifically said that reptiles other than turtles, barnyard animals, monkeys, kangaroos, and other non-domesticated animals are not considered common household animals for the purposes of this. So
I would tend to agree about the monkeys and kangaroos. I don't think I've ever seen someone with a kangaroo.
I actually went to the dentist, it was about a year ago, and there was a girl there with a kangaroo in a pouch.
Oh.
She worked at a zoo, and it was a baby, and so she basically had to care for it around the clock, but she was carrying it around in its pouch. It was large. I mean, it was a small kangaroo, but it was not tiny. But
that has to be an interesting
very
thing.
unusual.
I mean, zookeepers are a whole nother breed.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Very caring of animals.
So again, they've kind of limited this to dogs, cats, rats, rabbits, hamsters, fish, turtles. So these things that people keep around their house, these are all the things that are going to probably fall within the category of being an emotional support or a support animal in general. Right. Other reptiles, snakes, peacocks, monkeys, elephants, whatever, aren't going to fall within that unless they meet some sort of unique animal criteria.
Right, exactly.
So it's not to say that a snake isn't. Again, and this wouldn't necessarily go into all the details, but they can overcome that burden But in general, if it's a dog, a cat, something small, domesticated, those are ones that you're not really going to be able to question. But if they're like, yeah, I want to have this,
boa
duck,
constrictor,
a boa constrictor, a goose, like you can
Right.
probably say, okay, that's not going to fly unless you can provide to me some sort of information that shows that you need this unique animal, that you've got some unique circumstance that requires that. In that
Right.
case, again, if the doctor says, yes, I am recommending that they have this goose, well, okay, now we're in goose land, I guess.
Yeah.
So
I don't
hopefully
think,
that doesn't happen.
but most people don't really like geese,
Yeah.
right?
Most people don't.
Most people.
Most people don't. So
Right, exactly.
again, we've kind of gone through a lot here, and I think that this is going to be tremendously helpful. Again, I want everybody that does property management to go get this and read it and pass this out to people that do it.
Absolutely.
Because this is what we've been waiting for to make sure that it's cleared up.
Definitely.
Is really kind of the bottom line.
And with that, I think because this packet is so helpful and it's more of a guidance rather than just legislation, this is good to have whenever you're going through the lease or that sort of thing with the tenant, so that you can say, I know of this. I abided by this whenever we were discussing pet or service animal or emotional support or support animal, so that they know that if for whatever reason, whenever they are in your tenancy, because tenants can be there for a year, 3 years, and anything can happen, right?
Yep, absolutely.
They will know that you are knowledgeable of what's going to happen if something were to happen and they needed an animal at that point.
Exactly.
So I think just being able to slide that into the move-in folder
Exactly.
is going to be really nice as well.
Exactly. So I'm glad to hear that from you, that as somebody who does this day in and day out, I mean, I look at it from the perspective just like, yeah, this is great from the questions I get, but somebody who does this consistently day in and day out will find use in it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this, we've been saying multiple times, this is incredibly helpful. It's guidance, not just law, because law can be, it can seem odd,
Yeah.
or like why they make that decision, or why a turtle,
Yeah, right.
or whatever. But whenever you have this guidance, you have those questions. You do have that line drawn in the sand. You don't get to ask the why question.
Yeah.
You do get to ask for documentation, and this is the type of documentation that you're looking for, and you're getting rid of the internet documentation.
Yes.
That's incredibly helpful, because this is this and medical marijuana has been the biggest issues in property management.
Yeah.
Medical marijuana is still a big issue, but having this will make this not as much of a hot button issue.
Yeah.
Because the FDA is behind it.
Yeah.
So, and they do also mention the ADA, which it's good that they mention both, and they reference the ADA when it comes to the service animal.
Yeah.
And it being a dog and trained and that sort of thing, because then you don't have that question, that lingering question of, what does the ADA have to say?
Right.
Well,
We've
here it is.
given it to you. We've given you the scripts, exactly what the requirements are. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So like I said, this is going to be really helpful. I'm glad it was brought to my attention, because I saw, whenever you originally approached me for this, I just saw the new bill for Oklahoma. What was it, Bill? Hold on. 3282, the House bill that recently passed. I was like, okay, I have questions.
Yeah.
And then you sent this to me. I was like, oh, this alleviates every question.
Yeah.
All right, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I think, it goes further in, right?
It does. So then we get, it covers, again, the guidance on documenting. So this is the part that you can hand over to a potential tenant who says, well, what do I need to document it? And you can say, look, here's exactly what you need. Let me just give this to you. Take this to your doctor, whoever, and say, this is what I need.
Right.
And so that'll be really helpful as well.
Right. And I think a big thing about this is, when you are abiding by this, as a landlord, you're not seeming like the bad guy because you just want that pet fee, right? You're not doing that. You are making sure that you have the proper documentation, and that you are abiding by the fair housing guidelines. Because whenever you do have those tenants that might be trying to get away with not paying a pet fee, you come off as someone that's knowledgeable and someone that's not just there for the money, but just wants to make sure that, the house is going to be properly taken care of. And then you do seem concerned enough to understand that, okay, you request an animal.
Yep.
That's okay.
Perfect.
So.
I like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Being competent will make it not seem like you're being a shady landlord
exactly.
or, trying to get away with something or something like that. So just be knowledgeable on it.
Exactly. And the more knowledgeable you seem, the more likely they're going to open up and talk with you, because you don't have to ask why, but there are some chatty Cathys. And they will start talking about why and how and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So I got on the phone with somebody, with a tenant a couple of nights ago. They called me at like 7 o'clock at night.
Of course.
I just got off work, and she just started talking. I'm like, okay, no problem. Started talking about her life and ex-husband and all that. I'm just like,
So you're landlord.
Yeah, you just have to sit there, because sometimes a landlord is, they are there. Sometimes you're not getting a property. You're not renting out a property because it's a good thing. Sometimes, just like buying a house is not always a good experience.
Exactly.
It's downsizing or anything else negative.
Yeah.
So you can't always just approach it as a happy-go-lucky.
Exactly.
Everything's perfect.
Could be a
in the
divorce
world.
situation, or who knows what.
Exactly.
For sure.
So, which is why whenever we were talking about whatever we were talking about earlier with the new landlord-tenant act proposal.
Yeah.
That's why I was very adamant on the new clarifications that they're having there, because it's not always unicorns and rainbows.
Yes, exactly.
So that's my take.
I like it. Well, again, we think this is great. You've got that coming from the lawyer in the room and from the experienced property manager in the room. Again, if you're in this industry, you have to go get this. It's just,
absolutely.
Again, it's 19 pages. It's a resource for you. It's a guidebook on how to handle these situations now that we've never had before.
Right.
And it provides some new clarity that is going to be very helpful in the long run.
Absolutely. And even if you're not a property manager, if you are a real estate agent that does sales or whatever, you are a real estate agent. So you're going to be pulled aside with someone that says, oh, I'm a landlord. I blah, 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 blah. What do you think about service animals? I mean, I get that question all the time from my clients, from other tenants. Whenever I'm interviewing them to be my tenant, I get people saying, well, I'm getting kicked out because I have a dog. I'm like, why?
Yeah.
It gets you go into that conversation.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful with that.
Absolutely.
But it's good to have this information, even just as a realtor.
Yeah.
Because you want to be knowledgeable and you want to be able to answer the questions.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great point. So check it out. Again, we're going to link to it, or head on over to the HUD website and take a look at it, and you can find it there. So Jennifer, we have, just burned up the clock here. We appreciate so much for you coming in. Do you have any, want to give some contact information, some website or something like that, if people want to reach out to you and find you?
My website is currently under construction.
Oh, okay.
With my marketing firm. So no.
Not yet.
But I am happy to have you put my phone number on it. So if anyone has questions, you can text me. Don't call me. I'm not going to answer most of the time.
Yeah.
I'm usually in
meetings. But a tenant calling at a weird hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can always text me or talk to your broker, but definitely talk to your broker if. But yeah, I'm happy to answer questions too.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for coming in, Jennifer. We really appreciate it, and chatting about this new fair housing guidance for emotional support.
Fun.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for coming back for another week of Talking Real. We hope that this information on the new HUD guidance that was released is going to be very helpful for you. Again, go get that memo, check it out. It's 19 pages and is a gold mine of information for anybody that may come across an issue with support animals, assistance animals, service animals, those kinds of things. So definitely check that out. And thank you so much to Jennifer Hicks for coming and joining us on the episode. We always love to have a special guest here in the Talking Real studio. Now, don't forget that we've got Capital Conference coming up very, very soon here in just a few weeks. Make sure you get signed up for that. Again, it's free. You can go to okrealtors.com/Capital Conference to get signed up. And we really look forward to having a great showing this year to go out with one voice as realtors and tell the legislature what's important to the real estate industry. We also want to make sure that you're aware of the NAR Region 9 conference coming up. That's going to include realtors and leadership from the National Association and from across the states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri. It's going to be a great time here in Oklahoma City. You can get signed up for that at NAR Region 9. That's the number 9, not spelled out. NARRegion9.com. As always, we hope that you're sharing these episodes with a friend. If you know somebody who's dealing with issues with emotional support animals and service animals, point them to this episode so that they can get filled in as well. And we hope that you come back every single week right here on Talking Real. So until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.